Thanks so much for having me. I haven't dealt with the subject for quite some time, but I will tell you, I've been working on the subject of exiles and diaspora for over 3 decades. I published numerous books and essays on the subject. And what I will do, I just want to say a few words about the very essence of being an exile or in the diaspora, which is 2 different stories, and playing a role in international affairs. First and foremost, it has to be clear that the very essence of the nation state, be it an old nation state in the ancient world, which was also nation state because ethnicity and boundaries were always congruent, and this is something that has to be clear, from the time of the Second Temple on. It was very clear that boundaries were crafted by ethnicity and sometimes with religious affiliation, but boundaries were crafted by ethnicity and politics. And all the way to modernity, there were people who were residing outside their nation or their homeland. They were calling it a homeland, but they were still residing outside the homeland. This was the case in the time of the Persians. This was the case of the time of the Babylons. This was the time of the times of the Romans. How many of you would have known, for example, that the Jews, who were seen for generations to be part of the diasporic phenomena, were in fact known in the old world primarily as mercenaries. The Jews were the #1 mercenaries in the old world, and that's how they would be known. So they were amazingly critical for conflict resolution. They were the warriors of the old world because of their position outside their nation state. Being outside the nation state, they found themselves as mercenaries in other armies, including in the Roman army initially. And this is a very interesting point that is often overlooked by people who position the very idea of the Jews in the diaspora as part of their weakness, as part of the less warriors. Because diaspora in history has been describing the Jewish people less warriors because of lacking independence in politics. They had the position as warriors because they were mercenaries. And that's a very interesting point. Eric Gruen has written extensively about it. In the old days, in the old tradition, diaspora were part and parcel of the old nation state as well. They were traveling across the Middle East, for example, and they were playing roles in conflict resolution, sometimes aligning themselves with variety of contenders in the region. This has been the case during the time of the conflict between the Macedonians, for example, and the Jews during the Second Temple. And you see it, that the diasporas were playing a very important role on all sides. And of course, during the Roman times, during the Roman empires, you had diasporas built into the subject of conflict resolution. They were the transient sort of population that was used to be back and forth in the sense of between empires. Importantly speaking, of course, exile is a different story than a diaspora. Exile is defined for some people as people who are expelled, people who are thrown away from the countries. For modern times, as I define it in terms of like the political aspect of it, is that political exiles are those who are residing outside their claim homeland, or their home native state, who are fighting to change the way the homeland or the nation state are being governed. Think about Khomeini, think about Lenin, think about today the people who are fighting, let's say, in places like in Burma and other places. There are still those exiles who are fighting from outside the state. The exiles are those who are fighting to change the homeland way it's being governed. And therefore, they are opposition from outside the state. As opposition outside the state, they have a claim only to the homeland, and they never have, in the sense, trying to assimilate in the countries of domicile, be it called, as we call it, hostland. The notion of homeland and hostland is very important. In the old tradition, which I mentioned, and I speak fast, if I speak too fast, let me know. In the old tradition, there was also Xenia, for example, the Roman called it, sort of like the homeland, as opposed to the patrie, sort of like, which is a completely story of loyalty. Loyalty is always defining the idea of belonging. Conflict in that respect for the exile is always vis-a-vis the countries of origin in terms of like the regime. Or if there are not, like the Spanish Republicans fighting against the forces of Franco, if there are sitting as opposing claims by those who govern. For example, Palestinians fighting against Israel, it's not a home native regime. It's for self-determination or against occupation, as it was during World War II. In World War II, there were many groups of exile, governments in exile, and so on. They were part and parcel of the conflict. But they were fighting as contenders for a homeland which was taken by someone else. When for example, Charles de Gaulle is moving, as you know, to abroad after the French capitulated to the Brits in June of 1940, he claimed to be the leader speaking on behalf of France. Vichy government, which was the legitimate government of France, recognized as such by the United States and Britain, claimed that he is, of course, a traitor to his nation and to his. But Churchill, because of the war, allowed him to speak in the BBC, and he spoke the very famous speech in honor of France, and he led the Free French as a group of contenders against the whole native regime, but also against occupation. Interesting enough, when he came eventually back to France, Laval and Pétain were those who were accused of being traitors. He, of course, became the leader. So in that respect, you should understand in politics, once a loyalist, sometimes a traitor. This designation can change very much, and the exiles are always susceptible to such charges. Because fighting from outside the boundaries of the state, they are always kind of like pushed away. They are outsiders, and they will always be designated as traitors. This is the case, for example, today of Iranian exiles who are being designated and condemned by Khomeini's post-regime and later on, because there are those who are residing outside the nation state and in conflict are changing the categories of loyalties. You still have today people, the monarchies of the Shah. You have the Mujahideen Khalq, who have been very important in the conflict of Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. They were the perpetuators of this war, and in fact, they were the initiators of the war. During the war in Iraq, the last war in Iraq, when the Americans came, remember who was driving the Americans into the war? Chalabi, the Chalabis, those exiles who were residing abroad, who kind of are coming to the Americans and say, we can help you. Sometimes, therefore, exiles initiate wars, and sometimes they are the ones who perpetuate wars by getting also assistance from outside. We use them as a lever. This has been the case, for example, of the Cuban exiles who have been come to the United States, and the United States employed them in the Bay of Pigs. This was a crisis of amazing proportion, which would not have been done in that respect without the Americans having the lever of recruiting the equipment for the Bay of Pigs. They wouldn't invade it otherwise. They have been convinced at the time they can do it. So political exiles is a very important category. We can discuss it a long time. I've written several books. You can see the frontiers of loyalty because they define the loyalties across frontiers. And that is a very interesting case, how much you can define loyalty while residing outside. Many exiles, as a result of that, over the years, find themselves under duress. Because if you're in exile for so many generations, what will remain of you? Suddenly you become irrelevant, your kids are born abroad, and as a result of that, you become less and less loyal in the conceptual understanding of people. It's just like migrants can lose their claim to the homeland as a result of being far away from it. And nevertheless, even in generation times, as it was with the Huguenots and others historically speaking, you can still claim the homeland if you maintain a degree of attachment and a degree of organization. And in many respects, what the generation of the parents and grandparents already forgot, the generation, the third and fourth generation suddenly can remember. So the awakening is very important, and we saw it very much in the awakening in the wars that consumed Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Suddenly you saw Ukrainians and Albanians and people who became warriors. The exiles who became warriors. In the war between Croatia and Serbia, you see that people who were exiles in the older generation, their kids who already became Americans, suddenly mobilized. And that was a fascinating phenomenon. So in that respect, you can see that there is kind of a movement between the exilic nature to the diaspora. Now, what is the difference between the two? Diaspora is a term usually used as a way of speaking about people who reside outside the claim nation home nation state, who regard themselves or regard by others as members or potential members of the country of origin. As such, they're being called upon sometimes to mobilize. So you can see, you can be in diaspora. Many people know what diaspora. Give me an example of a diaspora that you know. Indians abroad. Numerous Indians abroad. And when there is a conflict with Pakistan, the Indians will be called upon to support India, and vice versa, of course. In Ethiopia, you see Ethiopians in the war against Eritrea. The war against Eritrea, when I travel with them, it's critical to see how they're being mobilized. Sometimes they may be mobilized by imposition, because the government of Eritrea forced them to be mobilized, otherwise they will hurt people at home. And they levy on them, of course, taxation and so on. But the diaspora is a permanent position, so to speak. They don't see themselves as exiled. Their code is also related to their country of domicile, the host land. Host land is something which is more of a permanent nature. So you can be a diasporic person because it's defined by yourself or by others. The diaspora designation is oftentimes a definition which is imposed on you. Exile is less so. Exile is more of like your intention, political exile, which is people who are fighting to replace a home native regime or a regime which is occupying on behalf of outsiders or in terms of colonialism. It's a very important distinction. Another term which is often used is transnationals, which is more of kind of like an economic term, transnationals. These are the people who 1 foot here, 1 foot there. It's kind of like the world is global. The center post of the center for diaspora is always homeland. You cannot be a diaspora unless there is a homeland. Transnational is kind of like someone who doesn't have a homeland in a sense. They can have many homelands. For example, the Jewish people, oftentimes people try to describe them as people who are transnationals. And therefore they like to designate them also as people who are rootless in that respect. They have no roots. They don't have a homeland. Historically speaking, after the collapse of the Second Temple in 70 AD, of course, when the Jewish tradition of homeland was dissipating because of the colossal failure, and especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 131-35, the whole legacy of a homeland was kind of like declined. It was reawakened later on, but it was declined in Judaism. People were fearing the homeland because they said sovereignty is something which is undermining our very existence. Diaspora is more of a neutral term. For example, everybody who lives in America who come from ethnic group is defined as a diaspora nowadays. Everybody. De Conde is even writing in his book, the historian, that even the Brits are diaspora. The Irish diaspora, the largest diaspora, 40 million strong. The Haitian diaspora, the Indian diaspora, the Norwegian diaspora, the German diaspora, which was a critical diaspora in terms of conflict. Don't forget that the German diaspora during World War I was 5 million strong, and when it was discovered by the President Wilson that the German Americans leadership was getting a telegram, what was known as the Zimmermann telegram, that is going to instigate Germany via Mexico. He warned all the Germans in America that if they will show disloyalty to America, they will be kicked out, and he threatened them. Ever since they erased the hyphen, there are no more German Americans in America today, and the umlaut, the 2 points on the phone. Interesting enough, because the subject of loyalty is very important. There were already 5 million. Japanese American, of course, in times of conflict, became suspects of disloyalty and were put into internment camp during World War II. So this designation can come and go, and it relates to how much the claims of the homeland oftentimes on the people who have long left their country. We the Jewish people often have a claim on Jewish Americans, and they have a claim on us. And they have a claim on us sometimes because others have designated them as co-nationals to us, notwithstanding the fact that they may see themselves completely Americans. But if others are saying, you know, the Jewish lobby, the Americans, and so on, they have certain expectations. So is, for example, for Arab Americans, for Kurds in the diaspora, for many others in Europe and otherwise. So you can see there's like lots of things that ought to be discussed. And as a result of that, one has to make some theoretical order and some comparative order. You cannot compare apples and oranges, as they say. And when you make comparison in the study of conflict resolution and diaspora, you have to take and make choices. What are you dealing with? What type of conflict? What type of community you're dealing with? And primarily, think about that politics is done with the elite. Elite are what politics is all about. It's not the masses. So when you deal with the diaspora, I've introduced 3 layers, or 3 circles. Here you have the core members. Every diaspora has a core member, the elite. They're small, well organized. Sometimes it's organized by exiles, like the Cuban exiles in Miami. And the Cuban exiles would mobilize the larger Miami community and the larger Cubans in America. And these are the rear guard members. These are the second tier. They're sometimes mobilized, sometimes not mobilized, they have memories and so on. And then there is the largest community, what Benedict Anderson would have called imagined communities. You designate them as belonging, but they're no longer belonging. There is a complete difference between the Cuban exile of Jorge Mascanosa or the Cuban exile of the 1960s and let's say Gloria Estefan and Miami Sound Machine. They're American, part and parcel. You know, when I studied the Cuban exile, traveling with them all over, there were 4-6 generations didn't know anything. It's not the same Alpha 6 or Omega 7, all those very ardent who thought they would come back to Cuba. 4th generation, 5th generation, they're fully Americans. They're in Congress, they're memories. But as I said before, they may be mobilized as a lobby, for example. Before they were lobby, they were warriors, but in Congress they were lobbies. Until they lose sort of like their attachment altogether, because their kids are no longer there. There may be but the core is very important. Every diaspora has to be organized in order to activate itself. And that is important for conflict. The conflict may be aggressive conflict, it can be diplomatic conflict, it can be even with other diasporas in the same level, trying to gain access to certain things in conflict resolution. They can be negotiators. Palestinian American, for example, were much more organized as exiles rather than as a diaspora. You hardly see a Palestinian diaspora in the same manner organized. You see an Arab Americans. I wrote a book on Arab Americans, and when I studied the case of the Palestinians, it was clear that they wanted to move away from the designation of Arab American, which is a more kind of like something of a culture, rather than more nationalist struggle vis-a-vis Israel. And that is an important factor to remember. So therefore, one has to understand, when you study the conflict resolution, you have to see that there is related to where you also struggle from. Diasporas, in that respect, are mostly associated with the liberal state. The diasporas, exiles can be in many countries. You can have Iranian exiles in Iraq, and they will use them in times of war. Exiles in times of war is a very peculiar position, because you're being challenged by your country that you're fighting with your enemy, and that's not a good position to be. When Willy Brandt, the head of the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, is going to Norway during the war, and he is fighting against the Nazis, when he comes back to be a chancellor later on, people will remember him and say, even though he fought against the Nazis, maybe he was dual loyalty. Ibrahim Yazdi, whom I met, who was leading member of the Islamic opposition to the Shah, the Persian Shah, was functioning from Minnesota and was mobilizing and so on. When he came back, and he took citizenship, which is kind of in America, I needed it. He married an American woman. When he came back, Khomeini had to issue a special document to say that he took American citizenship and so on as a strategic move in order to serve the opposition in times of war, which is quite interesting as a way of looking at people in terms of loyalty. Organized diasporas today are almost a cottage industry because everybody's talking about them. There are lots of books. I remember when we started the magazine Diaspora, I started it in the late 80s of the 20th century. Very few people dealt with them. But nowadays, in the times of globalization, they became very kind of like prominent on the center stage. Even though I would argue the prominence has been in decline, because the rise of the nation state has been strengthened rather than weaker. In the early 90s, many people thought that the nation state will be evaporated. The globalization should take away, and we are talking about a kumbaya society, and basically there will be a universal worldview. But that has not come to be, and that is a very important factor. In the question of diaspora and conflict in today's world, as I said, most of it is in the liberal states. Why? Because they're very difficult to be a diaspora, a natural diaspora with affinity to the homeland if you're not in a liberal state. So where you can have a diaspora? You can have a diaspora, let's say, in America, most of the diasporas. You can have a diaspora, for example, in Australia, you have many diasporas organized. You can have some diasporas organized, even though Germany doesn't recognize them, in Germany. And this causes some issues, especially with the issue of the Kurds in Turkey. And that is a very important factor. And you can have a diaspora sometimes, I would say, with mild influences, but in a different fashion, as ethnic groups. When you deal with diasporas, for example, as what the Russians call the near abroad. The near abroad are those people who reside outside the claimed nations in societies which are adjacent to the border. Many diasporas like that, Russians, who are residing in many countries which are the outcome of the post-Soviet Union. And they are ethnic groups in the post-Soviet states. Why? Because many times borders are moved over people, and sometimes people are moved over borders. Don't forget that. There were moves, they were removed there. The Soviet moved there, and suddenly there are new states, and they have to be activated. They don't want to be activated. But Putin will make a claim on them. Just as the German made claim on the Sudetenland. They suddenly became a diaspora as an ethnic group. The Sudetenland, as you know, was in Czechoslovakia prior to the war, was 24% of Czechoslovakia. And the German make a claim on them as part and parcel of their own. Therefore, Russia still make a claim on the 25 million strong near abroad, and oftentimes call them the diaspora. Others are, yes, 2 minutes, I'm done. And this was sort of like, they may propel a conflict, because Russia, as Germany did before, may invade these countries. We saw it in Donetsk, we saw it in Crimea, when the Russians, the near abroad, may make claims on behalf of their, they know there is someone who's pushing them. Let me conclude, because I have 1 minute. The diaspora in exile is a kind of like ongoing phenomenon historically. These are people who reside outside the boundaries of the state. The reference point is the nation state. Nation state that people thought is going away is not going away. It's here to stay, and it has been here since antiquity, even though many people think it's a modern phenomenon. It's more than only in the sense that we're talking about self-determination, but ancient world was always with nation states. Secondly, the conflict associated with them is about their status, about their role in the international system, the way the home state and the host state are designating them, and mostly the way they organize themselves. What claims do they have? In liberal states, they have a view and they have a position because they may have a clout on the country of domicile, the United States, as a lobby. Many people like to talk about the lobby. The Armenians had a tremendous impact on America on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh and the war against Azerbaijan. I was called to advise the Armenian government and the Azerbaijani government at the time on during the conflict, because it was very important to know that they could coalesce and say, what should we do? Why they could coalesce? Because America had an interest. On Law 907, on others, America had an interest in them. And they had an interest in their countries of origin for sake of identity. The Armenians were always exiles. After what they did, what the Turks did to them, they were exiles. And the exiles controlled the community, the Dashnak party. But after many generations, they're now kind of like helping Armenia. And they defined the Armenian identity. Because the exiles and the diaspora was stronger than the state itself. When Yerevan was established, and Petrosyan wanted to say that the exile will not determine his relation with Turkey, the exiles and the diaspora said to him, if you have signature of peace with Turkey, we're going to boycott you in America. And he retreated. And Kocherian came to power and said, Armenia's legacy is exiles and diaspora, and we will listen to them. Last point. Many countries have designated ministries of diaspora in the last 20 years for a variety of reasons. Built consulates. For example, Mexico alone from 1991 to now built 40 consulates in America because they think they can mobilize the diaspora. Many of them also look at the Jews in Israel as a model. They love to look at Israel as a model. They think it's a very successful model of mobilization. Almost every country today trying to build a diaspora ministry. And sometimes they use it as a conflict which is not necessarily war conflict, but a conflict which has to do with mobilization on the scale of diplomacy or in the media, etc., etc. So when you study the subject, it's huge. You have to zero in on what you want to do. You want to compare only when it's related to what you want to do, and then try to look at examples, and I try to look at the theoretical underpinnings of your study. Otherwise, it's a mess. And sometimes, even though it's a cottage industry, it's a messy cottage. Thank you so much.